Pawn to d4. Let's get started. Knight to f6, pawn to c4, pawn to g6, knight to c3, bishop to g7, pawn to e4. Now pawn to d6, a King's Indian defense. Knight to f3, castles, bishop to e2, simply preparing to castle. Pawn to e5. So why pawn to e5? Basically, black wants to provoke this move so that once the pawn has moved to d5, then he could now contemplate on knight to e8, then f5. Anyways, let's go back to the game with knight to c6, d5, knight to e7. Now knight to e1, as if trying to make this pawn mobile, which white exploits immediately soon after the game. And now black plays knight to d7. Why knight to d7? Knight to d7 simply pairs pawn to f5, as we discussed earlier. Now, white played pawn to f3. Some of you may ask, why not pawn to f4? This is a horrendous blunder in a positional point of view because of this move. Now we see this knight as a very strong knight in the center, and you don't want that. Plus, this e-pawn is severely weakened. Although it's a center pawn, but it's a weak center pawn because there's no pawn supporting it. There is no neighboring pawn. And if white takes, then black simply takes. And now black has some looming threats on the dark squares, which you may not also like. Anyways, after pawn to f3, pawn to f5. Pawn to f3 is simply a restricting move. It simply restricts the attacking, if you will, or potential prospects of black, because this pawn already has a ready-made defense, which is the pawn to f3. It also prepares this kind of maneuver, because after bishop to e3, f4, bishop to f2. Now we see that kind of maneuver. Without f3, this bishop could not have landed to f2. And with this bishop, it also supports the future advance of pawn to c4 to c5, which in turn may weaken this diagonal. Anyways, pawn to g5. With the idea of pawn to h5, pawn to g4, this is a typical King's Indian maneuver, and perhaps white was afraid of this. He didn't want this pawn to reach this square, so he played g4 himself. Black tries to soften this up, this pawn structure, with pawn to h5. Why pawn to h5? As you can see, he is trying to open the f-file for this pawn, because if this pawn moves here, then this knight would be quite effective at f4. Now pawn to h3, rook to f6, simply trying to play rook to h6, then perhaps having a long-term pressure on the h-file. Now knight to d3. White is simply trying to vacate his first rank, or his back rank if you will, and trying to support this future advance of this pawn c4 to c5, which we have discussed earlier. Now rook to h6. Black continues his plan on the king side, which is to pressure this h-file and maybe also this h-pawn. Pawn to c5. White makes a expansion of himself in the queen side, and black, feeling the pressure, perhaps decided to make some exchanges, and perhaps he hoped to relieve some tension through exchanges with knight takes pawn, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes. Although some simplification has been done, the position still has not simplified. Black still has his pressure here, and moreover white also now has a strong pressure on this a3 to f8 diagonal. Black, seeing this, played knight to g6. So what's the point of knight to g6? Knight to g6 simply prepares perhaps maybe knight to f, maybe knight to f4 in the future, and it also, most importantly, tries to introduce this bishop to f8 move, which tries to exchange this strong bishop at c5, because this bishop c5 is quite a monster itself. White just continues with rook c1. Anyways, bishop to f8 could not be stopped, so White anyways played this move and simply tried to make some pressure on the queen side. Bishop f8 anyways. White ignores this and played knight b5, simply trying to increase his advantage by targeting that weak c pawn, and eventually if that c pawn is taken off, then this rook will have a clear view on the c file, which could be quite dangerous for black. Bishop to d6. What an interesting move. This is quite interesting. It solidifies this chain here. This is like a pawn chain, except this bishop is not a pawn. It is a bishop, a bad bishop. But it's quite interesting because if for example, White exchanged this good bishop, then he would not anymore have a good bishop, and black would be happy to have his bad bishop, which is this bishop d6, be exchanged for this good bishop at c5. So this is quite clever by Van Wely. White anyways had a better plan and played queen to b3, simply trying to make this kind of pressure on the diagonal. As you can see, White is consistent with his plan, pressuring the c file, and now he has increased the pressure by introducing a new kind of pressure to this a3 to f8 diagonal. Now black takes. Black is starting his campaign on the h file, and perhaps he is going to penetrate finally the king side of White. White takes with the f pawn, simply to defend this weak pawn here, and maintaining that kind of plan. Now queen to e7. Black strengthens that diagonal, and hopefully he's trying to prevent black from entering the c file by strengthening this pawn chain. Because if White could not destroy this pawn chain, then he could not enter the c file. Now bishop takes, anyways, pawn takes. Now we see finally, this is now open. Could black have done something better? I don't think so. White's pressure on the queen side was just too much. Anyways, not to worry, black has his own compensation, and perhaps f3 later. Now we see, instead of playing the casual rook to c7, now we see the tactical knight takes pawn. Why knight takes pawn? The idea is, if black plays casually with rook to a7, then White could simply take with check, and now he is simply a pawn up. 6 pawns to 5 pawns. So this was impossible. So after knight takes pawn, black simply and wisely continues his pressure with queen to h7. And now we see, black continuing his pressure on this pawn, which is quite dangerous. White wisely plays rook to c3. Aside from the obvious protection, he is also preparing this maneuver, which in turn would create more pressure on the c file. This is quite interesting by So. Now finally, black unleashes a very clever move and a positionally strong move, I think. Could you guess the move? For those who haven't seen the game, I challenge you to guess the move. To those who have seen it, please don't bother to spoil that to the other audience. So I'll give you 5 seconds to guess. I think that's enough. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So black played, pawn to f3. Pawn to f3. What's the idea? This is a very nice idea because it introduces the concept, the strategic concept of knight to f4, which in turn may be very annoying towards the white camp in the king side. Especially when the king is in the king side. It is more dangerous. So after this, white had to take. White has to take anyways, because if he doesn't take this pawn, this would be very quite annoying. Bishop takes, bishop to d7, developing the last piece. Queen takes, and now rook to f8. Why not, instead of bishop d7, why not knight f4 immediately? This knight move could not be stopped and is inevitable. So black anyways just played another developing move and developed his last piece. So that was the reason why black played bishop to d7, because this knight to f4, this maneuver is unstoppable anyways. So queen takes pawn, rook to f8, and now we see black